truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, October 25th, 2024, the 1,374th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by looking in the show notes or visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so we are wrapping up another big week of 2024. We only have one more full week to go before the moment everyone's been waiting for a really long time, apparently. Now, if you ask me, I don't think that we are crossing some sort of finish line on November 5th. I think we are reaching the end of the second movie in a trilogy and starting the third movie One phase is ending and another one's going to begin, and that phase will require us to be diligent and discerning and committed and faithful and patriotic and hardworking, just like the last phase. Many of the past challenges will be overcome and new challenges will present themselves, and it's all good. Now, I was thinking about the subject matter of this show over the past few weeks and thinking about what's been in the news, which is truthfully not very much. Fake election stuff, fake Trump controversy stuff, various psychological operations pushing public sentiment in one direction or another on a number of different issues. Some of the ops are small and subtle, and some of them are gigantic. Fake foreign proxy wars and other various crises that make up this polycrisis phase. At least that's what's out front. But behind that, we have all of these other story developments along the lines we've been tracking over the last 4 years that went largely ignored by virtually everyone else beyond some segments of the truth community, some of the Q people, and then those of us who track these things through the lens of devolution or something similar. In the aftermath of Joe Biden's fake inauguration on January 20th, 2021, I said we were going to have to walk two paths at the same time, and I think we've been pretty successful in doing that. But unless you really are tracking it constantly, it doesn't make itself readily apparent. And so, of course, anyone who doubts it thinks we must be insane. And hey, maybe we are. That was enough for most of the people in the normie sphere, and they just checked out. They didn't bother walking that other path at all. They just stuck with the central narrative and tried to learn absolutely everything about what the TV was saying. And maybe there's a place for that. Maybe it has some enduring value. I can't tell what that is, but maybe that will become more apparent in the future. Everyone is focused on waking up the normies to the point where they themselves have become the normies in need of waking up. Behind all that, something else has been happening, and it's becoming apparent. When I started counting the days of dystopia back in 2021, I definitely did not think it would take 4 years for everything to get sorted out. And like many of you, I didn't think we could make it that long. Plus, of course, things became harder immediately, more upsetting, more frustrating. I couldn't imagine going through that for 1,400 days, but here we are, having walked both of those paths simultaneously for this entire time. Kind of makes me think about trying to bring down a massive tree with an axe. You just have to keep chopping and chopping and chopping away at it, and eventually it starts to sway and wobble, and with every chop, it seems like it's ready to go, and then finally it does. Out of nowhere, one chop does it, and it falls over. And things really do seem to be swaying and wobbling right now. It's almost as if they designed the whole story to reach these points at this exact time. Who could have ever imagined it? Now, we've spent the better part of the last month or two talking about the degree of regime control and the tools and the methods the regime uses to increase that control, to bring all the nations of the world to heel. First, it's the control through reputational manipulation. For the individual, for an entity, for an organization, for a government, the exploitation of blackmail based on corruption or compromise. And if those methods don't work, then they begin to use the incentive and punishment structure of finance. They control the global regime fiat currency. They control global banking and payment systems so they can wage economic warfare through sanctions. They can debank individuals. They can turn you into a billionaire, or they can send a billionaire to the poorhouse. And if none of that works, then they have the military operating under the purview of NATO, the United Nations, the global intelligence agencies. This is how things have worked for decades, probably for centuries, maybe for millennia, maybe since the dawn of mankind. It seems like they're losing control of it, of all of it. And yesterday we talked about the degree of military control, whether or not Trump had seized back control over the global military apparatus, putting it back under civilian authority. And since putting the episode up yesterday, we get this clip featuring Colonel Douglas Macgregor on Judge Napolitano's show.
Our colleague, Ambassador Charles Freeman, refers to this person as the worst Secretary of State since World War II, cut number 16.
Israel has achieved most of its strategic objectives when it comes to Gaza, all with the idea of making sure that October 7th could never happen again. In the space of a year, it's managed to dismantle Hamas's military capacity. It's destroyed a bunch of its arsenal. It's eliminated its senior leadership, including, most recently, Yahya Sinwar. This has come at the cost, great cost, to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Now is the time to turn those successes into an enduring strategic success. And there are really two things left to do. Get the hostages home and bring the war to an end with an understanding of what will follow.
Is he credible? Netanyahu will never bring the hostages home. Then there's no reason for war.
Well, let's understand something. Everyone in the world today, not just in the Middle East, but virtually everyone, views Blinken as Netanyahu's point man. And that's what he is. Our government is being hijacked. There's no one up there directing much of anything. They are, along with the government in London, by the way, they are all 100% on board with the Greater Israel Project. And he's certainly not going to say anything other than what he has. So everybody knows that he repeats Netanyahu's talking points. There's no daylight between them. One wonders just what happens in the White House behind the scenes, let alone the State Department. I think the one place that there are some voices that don't fall in line is DOD, because the CIA is joined at the hip with MI6 and Mossad. So virtually no daylight between those entities and us. And of course, the American people know nothing about it, have never been consulted, and the media ensures that the truth about what's actually happening on the ground never gets through.
Does it sound less like a conspiracy theory when Colonel Macgregor says it? He's talking about the quote-unquote White House, the fake administration. He says they're not really directing much of anything up there. He says that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is essentially just repeating whatever Netanyahu says. Napolitano asks about the hostages and the leverage that provides. I've said many times that I don't believe there are any hostages. Donald Trump has said many times that the hostages are gone, implying either that they're dead or that they were never there in the first place. But the hostages are a key narrative leverage point, and Donald Trump erases that leverage when he says that there are no hostages there. Now, I don't know if Macgregor is referring to Netanyahu in a literal sense or a narrative sense, but I certainly take that more in a narrative sense. Netanyahu is not the person running the entire world. He's not the one making all of the decisions. Antony Blinken is certainly a servant of the global regime, but I don't imagine he is literally just carrying out Benjamin Netanyahu's orders. Netanyahu simply seems to be playing his own role, one that seems to be dependent on deference to Donald Trump, not to the global governing bodies or the puppet leaders within the Western hegemony. Let's listen to this one small section once again.
Our government is being hijacked. There's no one up there directing much of anything. They are, along with the government in London, by the way, they are all 100% on board with the Greater Israel Project. And he's certainly not going to say anything other than what he has.
Our government has been hijacked. They're all fully on board with the Greater Israel Project. Now, we've talked about that a few times, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I asked Perplexity AI so that I could get a nice, clean answer. What is the Greater Israel Project? The answer is the Greater Israel Project, also known as the Greater Israel Movement or Zionist Plan for the Middle East, is a concept that involves the expansion of Israel's territory and sovereignty to include areas that proponents believe are part of Israel's historic or biblical land. The idea of Greater Israel is rooted in biblical references, particularly the promise of land to the children of Israel, which is described as stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. And of course, any belief in this agenda depends on the belief that the global regime proxy state called Israel is the biblical Israel. But let's continue. Theodor Herzl, the founding father of Zionism, envisioned a Jewish state extending from the Brook of Egypt to the Euphrates. The concept of Greater Israel is supported by religious and secular right-wing nationalists in Israel, It is a central ideological goal of the Likud party, which has dominated Israeli politics since 1977. And of course, they would count Netanyahu among their members. Now, I was shocked by all this because I was told that we're not supposed to talk about Israel wanting to take over other lands and dominate the world on behalf of the Zionist project. So I asked Perplexity, wait, you mean that's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? Zionists really are focused on world domination? The answer was the concept of Greater Israel is not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but rather a real and contentious ideological and political goal within the Zionist movement. It goes on. The pursuit of Greater Israel is highly controversial and has significant international implications. It involves the expansion of Israeli settlements in occupied territories, which is illegal under international law. The plan is also linked to broader geopolitical strategies, such as the Yinon Plan, which aims to ensure regional superiority by balkanizing surrounding Arab states into smaller, weaker entities. It is crucial to distinguish this from anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, such as the Zionist occupation government Zog theory, which falsely claims that Jews secretly control governments and international institutions. The Greater Israel Project, while controversial and expansionist, is rooted in Zionist ideology and historical claims rather than a baseless conspiracy theory. In summary, the idea of Greater Israel is a real and debated aspect of Zionist ideology focused on territorial expansion within the Middle East rather than a conspiracy theory about global domination. Of course, what they don't mention is that it wouldn't be possible to take over the entire Middle East without some pretty substantial backing from global allies. You actually would have to control just about the entire world to be able to pull something like that off. I mean, or you could just destroy everybody else. But Israel can't do that all by themselves, so they need help, and that's right back to where the whole global domination thing comes in. I let Perplexity know this, and in the response, the pursuit of Greater Israel does involve cooperation and support from other global powers, particularly the United States. The U.S. has been a strong supporter of Israel and has aligned its foreign policy in the Middle East to some extent with Israeli goals. However, this support is more about regional hegemony and strategic interests rather than a global domination agenda. Of course. The connection to U.S. neoconservative policies, as mentioned in Netanyahu's speeches and other analyses, involves a broader strategy to control resources, trade routes, and geopolitical influence in the Middle East. This is part of a regional strategy rather than a global domination plan. The wars in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, for example, are seen as part of this agenda to weaken potential adversaries to Israel and secure control over key regions. But you gotta remember, as soon as you say this is a plan for global domination, that's when it becomes an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But let's put all of that aside for a moment and just focus on the fact that Colonel Macgregor essentially said United States foreign policy and the United States military have been controlled by global powers in service of this Greater Israel project that requires global domination. And we're all supposed to be okay with that because it's based on a very particular reading of the Bible. Now, that particular reading has spread far and wide, but it remains a particular reading. Our country being controlled by foreign powers is not a conspiracy theory. It's just the state of the world. It won't be that way forever, but it has been that way, and it's remained that way no matter how many elections we've had. Donald Trump is the only one who has changed American foreign policy, thrown a wrench into the whole system. And on this Israel issue particularly, Donald Trump has managed to get both sides of the regime's controlled opposition dynamic relative to Israel to destroy themselves, narratively speaking, which is why Israel has normalized relations with countries in the Middle East, and there's some reason to hope for a long-term peace. Vladimir Putin this week held a summit of the BRICS coalition and prospective partner nations in Kazan, Russia. The headline from Monday in CNN was "The West Wants Putin Isolated." A major summit he's hosting shows he's far from alone. From the article, Nearly 3 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine saw Moscow condemned by countries globally, leader Vladimir Putin is staging a summit with more than a dozen world leaders, an appointed signal from the autocrat that, far from being alone, an emerging coalition of countries stands behind him. The 3-day BRICS summit, starting Tuesday in the southwestern Russian city of Kazan, is the first meeting of the group of major emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, since it expanded earlier this year to include Egypt, the UAE, Ethiopia, and Iran. Leaders expected to attend include China's Xi Jinping, India's Narendra Modi, Iran's Masoud Pezeshkian, South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as those from outside the club like Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was expected to join, but canceled his trip after suffering an injury at home. And that's too bad, because Brazil's Joe Biden was surely totally welcome at BRICS. Set to be by far the largest international gathering the Russian president has hosted since the start of the war in February 2022. The gathering of BRICS and other countries this week spotlights a growing convergence of nations who hope to see a shift in the global balance of power and, in the case of some, like Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, directly counter the United States-led West. It's this latter message that Putin and close partner and most powerful BRICS country leader Xi will project in the coming days. It's the West that stands isolated in the world with its sanctions and alliances, while a global majority of countries support their bid to challenge American global leadership. From the Hindustan Times on Tuesday, India ready to help restore peace. Prime Minister Narendra Modi tells Vladimir Putin on Ukraine conflict. Prime Minister Modi on Tuesday reiterated a peaceful solution to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. During his bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan, Modi said, "I have been in constant touch with you on the subject of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. As I have said earlier, we believe that the problems should be resolved in a peaceful manner. We fully support the early establishment of peace and stability. All our efforts give priority to humanity. India is ready to provide all possible cooperation in the times to come." Now, we've covered India this year to some considerable length. Their elections a few months back, where, of course, Modi was re-upped as prime minister, but his party somehow, well underperformed expectations. A few months back, Modi traveled to Ukraine to make progress on the peace there, signing a mutual defense pact, while sending one of his emissaries to the United States to do the same thing. And of course, India has relations with China and with Russia, its BRICS partners. Isn't that amazing? They have alliances with us and the very sovereign state of Ukraine, whose democracy we're totally protecting, and the enemies of us and that very sovereign democracy in Ukraine. How does it happen? From RT Today, Russia ready for rational compromise with Ukraine. Moscow remains willing to negotiate a resolution of the Ukraine conflict in which both sides would make compromises, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said. Putin was asked how his government envisioned the end of hostilities with Ukraine during a late-night interview on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan, which Russian media released on Friday morning. Any outcome should be favorable to Russia, and I say that directly, he said. That said, Moscow does not rule out compromises on its part as long as they are, quote-unquote, rational, the Russian leader added. Unfortunately, Ukraine's unwillingness to negotiate renders moot any discussions of what Moscow would be willing to offer. Putin said Moscow had recently received a proposal from Ankara to discuss a possible deal, which an aide to Turkish President Erdogan said was coming from Kyiv. We agreed to it, and the next day, Ukrainian leader Zelensky publicly announced that he will not negotiate anything, the president said. This is irrational behavior, which is hard to predict. No plans can be based on this foundation, so there is no sense in discussing whether we would reach an agreement and what it would be, Putin explained. So once again, we see Putin willing to compromise and the West saying no way. Or at least that's how it's being portrayed to us, because, of course, there won't be any resolution to any of these situations until Donald Trump is once again publicly recognized as the president of these United States. So Modi's talking peace, Putin's talking peace, and then there's this from Reuters yesterday. Russia's proposed grain exchange for BRICS countries may take years to launch. Oh, so it's not really going to happen. Is that what you're saying, Reuters? You're letting your global allies know, hey guys, don't worry. We're not going to let this happen. Their predictions along those lines are always so accurate. Russia's proposal for a new international grain exchange could take years to get off the ground, even though the plan was welcomed by members of the BRICS group of countries at a summit this week in Kazan. Russia has been pushing to establish the exchange as part of a broader plan to create new financial instruments, detach its trade from the U.S. dollar, and help Moscow combat Western sanctions. President Vladimir Putin said at the summit that BRICS countries, which are among the world's largest producers of grains, legumes, and oilseeds, could establish such an exchange, potentially expanding it to trade other major commodities. Edward Zernin, head of the Grain Exporters Union, whose members export 80% of Russian grain, said that based on the experience of creating the BRICS New Development Bank, launching the joint exchange would require years of preparatory work. Zernin stated that the proposed new exchange should have international status to protect it from potential Western sanctions. Well, that's an interesting point, or they could just decide that they don't care about that, which is probably what's going to happen. The economic warfare waged against the Russian people at the beginning of Putin's very brutal invasion may have caused some temporary problems, but they seem to have weathered it just fine. The Western sanctions mechanism just seems to be one more weapon, one more tool that they've lost control of. The main stage of the process has been completed. The initiative to create an exchange has been approved at the level of BRICS country leaders, Zernin said. It's hard to see any reason why they wouldn't just keep marching forward. I mean, honestly, who's stopping them? Now, you always got to be careful when you're asking questions like that, because John Kirby will just pop up out of nowhere. Here is that Pentagon spokesperson this week. He's beginning to sound like Baghdad Bob. And every time I think about Baghdad Bob now, all I can think was, oh, that was probably a psyop too. Maybe Baghdad Bob was telling the truth. Here is the ridiculous John Kirby.
Korean soldiers do enter into combat. This development would demonstrate Russia's growing desperation in its war against Ukraine. Russia is suffering extraordinary casualties on the battlefield every single day. But President Putin appears intent on continuing this war. If Russia is indeed forced to turn to North Korea for manpower, this would be a sign of weakness, not strength, on the part of the Kremlin. It would also demonstrate an unprecedented level of direct military cooperation between Russia and North Korea, with security implications in Europe as well as the Indo-Pacific. As we have said before, Russia's cooperation with the North Korean military is in violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions which prohibit the procurement of arms from North Korea and military arms training. This move is likewise a violation. At President Biden's direction, the United States continues to surge security assistance to Ukraine. In just the past week, which I think you've seen, the United States has announced more than $800 million in security assistance to meet Ukraine's urgent battlefield needs. Now, looking ahead, the United States is on track to provide Ukraine with hundreds of additional air defense interceptors, dozens of tactical air defense systems, additional artillery, significant quantities of ammunition, hundreds of armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, and thousands of additional armored vehicles, all of which will help keep Ukraine effective on the battlefield. And in coming days, the United States will announce a significant sanctions tranche targeting the enablers of Russia's war in Ukraine located outside of Russia. The Ukrainian military continues to fight bravely.
These are the people who told us that Putin was isolated from the rest of the world. These are the people who told us that this was all about Putin's very brutal invasion. Why does the West pretend that it's winning? Why do they continue to send resources? Why do they keep prolonging the quote-unquote war if it was all about Putin's very brutal invasion? This is from Breitbart today. 13 more countries join BRICS as partners, could press for full membership. And I just want to highlight the fact that the main picture in this article is of Vladimir Putin shaking hands with Nicolas Maduro. So how about that? I wonder if that's why they're always trying to overthrow the leader of the country with the biggest oil reserves in the world. Nah, it's probably because he's stealing elections. They don't like that. The China-dominated BRICS economic bloc on Thursday announced it has added 13 nations as partner countries, including 3 African nations, Nigeria, Algeria, and Uganda. The announcement was reported by Russia's TASS news service and confirmed by comments from Cuban and Nigerian government sources. These partners will reportedly have much more limited involvement than full BRICS members, but some or all of them could aspire to membership in the future. In addition to the 3 African nations, the list of BRICS partners includes Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Thailand, Turkey, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time on most of these countries, but I can tell you that Belarus, Bolivia, and Thailand were all targets of color revolutions within the last few years, particularly in 2020. And in fact, earlier this year, I did an episode on a farce of a coup down in Bolivia. The article notes that Turkish President Erdogan leads a NATO country that's forming a currency alliance with Russia, the country NATO was formed to quote-unquote defend against. Further on in the article, China's state-run Global Times celebrated the expanding BRICS membership as another sign that twilight has arrived for the post-World War II Western order. The Global Times quoted Chinese dictator Xi Jinping hailing the enlargement of BRICS as a, quote, landmark event in the evolution of the international situation, end quote. He touted the bloc as a vehicle for, quote, strengthening solidarity and cooperation among global South nations, end quote, which could give the China-led alliance enough muscle to implement global governance reform, by which Xi means stripping the U.S. and Europe of their influence. The Global Times eagerly provided backup vocals for Xi's Death of the West performance by gushing about how much of the world's surface area is controlled by BRICS nations and how the bloc is, quote, shaping global trends in world politics to a large extent. Breitbart says this grandiose language is somewhat out of step with how little BRICS has actually done over its 15-year lifespan, although some of its leaders have very big plans for the future, such as Russia and China's determination to create an alternative financial system that would dethrone the U.S. dollar and destroy the Western world's ability to impose human rights sanctions. Oh man, it's like they're losing all of their tools, their weapons for global domination and control. Does any of this threaten America and the American people? I mean, you could make that argument from a globalist perspective based on the downside we might experience during an adjustment period, but it's already been happening gradually over the course of years. And regardless, the adjustment needs to happen. America can't simply be a powerful tool for enforcement and control by those pursuing a one-world liberal international rules-based order. That's antithetical to our Constitution and to the purposes of our founding. It's also antithetical to the desires of the American people, which is why they never share the true intent of this plan in the first place. All right, so let's bring it all back to the United States. We've spent much of this week talking about how Donald Trump is now literally Hitler for the 9th straight year, based on claims from former Trump chief of staff and retired General John Kelly that he made 2 years ago and just reconfirmed, making it breaking news that he said the thing he's reported to have said in a book from 2 years ago that he actually said a long time ago. All of that is true, according to John Kelly, so therefore Donald Trump is literally Hitler again. Now, the claim was that Donald Trump had said to John Kelly he wanted Hitler's generals. Plenty of people familiar with these conversations have come out to say Donald Trump has never said anything like that. But it's an interesting story to get out there. I wasn't aware of this. I just found this out this morning. There is actually a book titled Hitler's Generals in America by a man named Derek Mallet, Mallet. Here is part of the description on Amazon. In Hitler's Generals in America, Derek Mallet examines the evolution of the relationship between American officials and the Wehrmacht general officers they held as prisoners of war in the United States between 1943 and 1946. During the early years of the war, British officers spied on the German officers in their custody, housing them in elegant estates separate from enlisted soldiers, providing them with servants and cooks, and sometimes becoming their confidants in order to obtain intelligence. The Americans, on the other hand, lacked the class awareness shared by British and German officers. They ignored their German general officers, refusing them any special treatment. By the end of the war, however, the United States had begun to envision itself as a world power, rather than one of several allies providing aid during wartime. Mallet demonstrates how a growing admiration for the German officers' prowess and military traditions, coupled with post-war anxiety about Soviet intentions, drove Washington to collaborate with many Wehrmacht general officers. Drawing on newly available sources, this intriguing book vividly demonstrates how Americans undertook the complex process of reconceptualizing Germans, even Nazi generals, as allies against what they perceived as their new enemy, the Soviet Union. So that's really something. Apparently, it's just a historical fact that Hitler's generals became great sources of intelligence on the enemy and the enemy's tactics. Or at least that's one way to take it. And of course, there's no reason to believe that Trump actually said what John Kelly claims he said, but viewed through this lens, that would sound a lot different. Saying that you would like Hitler's generals would then be equivalent to saying that it would be nice to have some of the high-ranking officials of the enemy providing intel on strategy and tactics. I wonder if this is one of the aspects of the post-World War II order that has these other countries around the world so concerned. How strange to go from collaborating with Nazi officials to working with the global regime to pursue a one-world liberal international rules-based order. You wouldn't think there was a match there. But then you have to remember the transfer agreement, the partnership between Zionists and Nazis. It's weird that these books were never part of our curriculum in any of our state schools. But anyway, Trump's a fascist. In fact, he's literally Hitler. Why not let Hillary Clinton tell you just how Hitler he is?
And one other thing that you'll see next week, Caitlin, is Trump actually reenacting the Madison Square Garden rally in 1939. I write about this in my book. President Franklin Roosevelt was appalled that neo-Nazis, fascists in America were lining up to essentially pledge their support for the kind of government that they were seeing in Germany. So I don't think we can ignore it. Now,
that's right. You can't ignore the things she's making up. Donald Trump is literally Hitler. And if you don't believe her, look, Donald Trump is going to do a rally at Madison Square Garden. Nazis were also at Madison Square Garden. That makes Trump a Nazi. Of course, the New York Knicks play at Madison Square Garden too, so that makes Trump an NBA player. Madison Square Garden also hosts rodeos, so I guess that makes Trump a bull. And they host monster truck rallies, so that makes Donald Trump the monster truck gravedigger. How could he? Oh, that Donald Trump. Speaking of Trump, he just sent another shot across the bow, a warning about malfeasance in the fake election we are currently enduring. He said on Truth Social this morning, cease and desist. I, together with many attorneys and legal scholars, am watching the sanctity of the 2024 presidential election very closely because I know better than most the rampant cheating and skullduggery that has taken place by the Democrats in the 2020 presidential election. It was a disgrace to our nation. Therefore, the 2024 election where votes have just started being cast, will be under the closest professional scrutiny. And when I win, those people that cheated will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, which will include long-term prison sentences so that this depravity of justice does not happen again. We cannot let our country further devolve into a third world nation, and we won't. Please beware that this legal exposure extends to lawyers, political operatives, donors, illegal voters, and corrupt election officials. Those involved in unscrupulous behavior will be sought out, caught, and prosecuted at levels, unfortunately, never seen before in our country. Now, you may have heard that before because Donald Trump has issued that statement on Truth Social before. In fact, he's done it a couple of times, starting back in early September. Now, it was determined back in 2017 that Donald Trump's social media posts were official statements as president. And of course, they still are. Are threats like these the reason that the commies are panicking? Yes. Is Donald Trump only talking about the fake election of 2024? No. It's always important to remember that Joe Biden did not receive 81 million real lawful American votes, and no one could ever prove that he did, which is why they don't let us check. Donald Trump never conceded. Joe Biden's quote-unquote win was not legitimately certified, and Joe Biden was not legitimately inaugurated. He has not been a legitimate president. He's been a fake president, just a temporary face of the American Uniparty. We've spent a lot of time on the Uniparty panic over the last couple of weeks, as well as various post-election scenarios. Politico published an article today featuring an illustration of Washington, D.C. with barbed wire all across the picture. The headline of the article: "The election is looming, and these Washingtonians are running scared." Now, we're not going to go through the whole article here. It's quite long, and it's also one of those articles where they highlight certain people's individual stories, allowing us to sympathize with their little commie emotions that are totally made up. But I want to go through a bit of it. As Washington reaches the end of a fraught election season and prepares for a potentially even more fraught interregnum, people across the political spectrum are expressing worry about a violent display by the losing side. For liberals, fears of a January 6th rerun are baked in, based on very real history. Oh yes, very real. But conservatives also worry about Antifa-style outrage. So, Antifa is real? I thought they were a conspiracy theory. Which means all kinds of people are scouting conveniently timed vacations. The policy scholar who was happy to find he had business in Los Angeles and his wife would be in Florida. The former Hill staffer who decided months ago that election week was a good time for a Mediterranean voyage. The liberal think tanker who planned an Arizona bike getaway. Oh, all of that sounds lovely. I thought we were going to get another article about how they were all fleeing the country, because we've certainly had a bunch of those, and we've covered them on this podcast because they're hilarious. Though the Capitol building's role on Election Day is minimal, one of their story subjects sees November 5th as dicey as well. "I feel like election week might be crazy too," she said. "I don't know what's planned, but I don't want to be near it. I know that the response here is like, let's bring out the tanks. Let's bring out the people with guns. That doesn't make me feel safe either." And wow, who's saying that? Is Commander-in-Chief Joe Biden going to do that? What are they expecting? Why aren't they warning the American people? It's only 10 days away. If you're in Washington, you've probably been privy to the same sorts of conversation. Some of the getaway planning, I suspect, represents a perennial case of nerves. Partisans worried their side will lose want to find an excuse to be far away from the gloom when it happens. But more of it involves a post-2020 idea of what an election could bring to a capital where, quote-unquote, partisan warfare never used to be a literal term. Well, it's still not a literal term, but the reason there was never much contentiousness between the parties is because it's only one party. It's a uniparty. The idea we've had two parties has always been an illusion. And hopefully once we get through this period, there won't be any parties anymore. Now, with memories of the last election still fresh, Washington is awkwardly coming to grips with the idea that there's a not zero chance that the national election could spiral into the sort of violent chaos that locals used to think only happens in a politically unstable banana republic. Well, hey guys, that's what we have. MAGA didn't overthrow the country. MAGA is trying to reverse that. The odds against a cataclysm, public safety pros tell me, are long. Yet they're not long enough for some. In a city accustomed to large political gatherings, there's not a lot of muscle memory about what to do about the kinds of chaos some are imagining. Skipping ahead. Earlier this month, D.C.'s Golden Triangle Business Improvement District, which represents employers on the office-dense western side of downtown Washington, gathered members along with officials from Homeland Security, the Secret Service, the U.S. Park Police, and the local Metropolitan PD to walk through a tabletop exercise about what might happen if the core of the Capitol was convulsed by election violence. On one hand, the exercise was exactly what a business district ought to be doing. They've also had tabletop exercises on natural disasters, active shooters, and terrorism. The idea is to help employers understand who reports to whom, what happens in an emergency, and how to keep their staff safe. But the subject matter, unimaginable before 2020, was telling. So was the specific role-playing scenario. Concerned that an exercise about inter-party chaos would appear partisan, the group asked participants to game out what would happen in the event the Beagle Party and the Dalmatian Party were at each other's throats following a disputed election. Yeah, that'll refute any claims of partisanship. But of course, the traditional understanding of partisanship is nonsense. There is just a uniparty. In the scenario, security staff and HR honchos had to make decisions while wading through deep fakes, reports of mayhem in other cities, and images of unknown people popping up on building security cameras. When to send staff home, how to secure the door, who to call for help. What in the world are these people preparing for? It was a range of decisions on the kinds of things they would do, said Leona Aguridis, the business group's executive director. Where the learning occurred was them thinking it through. And then, rather than having me or our head of security teach them, we had the police explain what happens in situations, how they deal with them. If the exercise left participants feeling a bit less confused, the very fact that it was necessary remains a subject of embarrassment in a country that thought itself as being better than the fragile democracies whose elections descend into violence. Well, sorry, commies, we're not the ones who decided to steal elections. We're the ones who realized they've always been stolen. As for the scenario of a Trump victory leading to marauding crowds of left-wing protesters, Holt says he wasn't hugely concerned about that either. Much of the organized group's passion, he said, is tied up in opposing the Israel-Hamas war, an event that has also lent a pox on both your houses vibe to their understanding of the Trump-Harris contest. A lot of the radical left groups that I keep my eye on seem to be mutually disgusted with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, he said. That energy has largely been spent elsewhere. And that's quite interesting. There's at least some reason to believe that Antifa was fully tracked throughout the 2020 Summer of Love, through the election period and the post-election period, and they've somehow just kind of disappeared. We thought they would reappear after the Dobbs decision in 2022, but they didn't. The commies haven't even been able to pull off a nice BLM for the last few years. But let's continue. Which is all to say that if America is about to witness a spasm of post-election violence, it's far less likely to happen in Washington than in some swing state, county seat, or legislature. Oh, well, there's no talk about Trump people doing that anywhere, so how could you say something like that unless you're the ones planning it? But wait, they write, or maybe not. After 2 centuries of stable democracy, Americans just aren't very good at gaming out the odds around questions of election-related personal safety. If you ask me, people who study extremism sound like they're on solid ground when they say Washington is unlikely to be the scene of a post-election riot. And people responsible for public safety sound like they've done their homework when it comes to incorporating 2020's lessons in order to keep residents safe. But I have a hard time blaming folks who are gripped by worry about the long odds alternative scenarios. Politics has changed, and a capital whose culture is built on process and credential isn't really built to deal with it. Huh. Well, that's strange. I thought we were going to read an article about how Washingtonians were going on vacation, just normal vacations. But all of a sudden, it became about a weird tabletop exercise involving the Metropolitan Police Department and DHS. What do they expect to happen at all of these Washington, D.C. office buildings? Are these the locations where the people Donald Trump keeps mentioning in his cease and desist posts actually work? Are these the offices of the lawyers, political operatives, and donors Trump was referring to? I guess we'll find out. And by the way, this Politico headline has changed a couple times. A version prior to this was people in Washington are fleeing town for Election Day. And a version before that was petrified D.C. residents are fleeing town for Election Day. I guess they had to get rid of petrified, and then they had to get rid of fleeing town. And all of this is so strange because, of course, these members of the Uniparty and everyone around them, these people are the ones in control. They have control over all these American institutions, most especially the American military. Why are they scared when they have all this control and the backing of the global regime, the propaganda media, the levers of finance? They have all this control and they're still running scared. They're fleeing town. They're worried about being sent off to prison for their entire lives. There's an absolute meltdown happening. Some of the regime's key figures online are freaking out about the fact that the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post aren't publishing presidential endorsements, as if those matter. The ownership of the LA Times offered for the editors to provide an endorsement in the form of an objective weighing of the policies put forward by each candidate. But they declined. They didn't want to do something like that because they didn't want to critique the Kamala Harris policies, of which there aren't really any, which is not to say there aren't policies that would be pushed by a regime having Kamala Harris as the face. That's just the global regime agenda. And the editors of the LA Times can't tell you the downside of that agenda because the entire purpose of their existence is to tell you the good side of that agenda. And of course, they also can't then tell you that Donald Trump's agenda is whatever the opposite of that agenda is. Those are your choices. Do you want the global communist agenda represented by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations 2030 agenda? Do you want to be part of the quest for global domination, the one world liberal, international rules-based order? Or do you want to make America great again? You can forget about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is nothing. She's a vessel. Donald Trump just said it the other night. She's irrelevant. Not only did the Washington Post decline to endorse Kamala Harris, it seems like their entire editorial viewpoint has flipped overnight. Patriots in Control put this graphic together of Washington Post headlines from the last couple days. Opinion: Kamala Harris forgets to hide her abortion radicalism. Opinion: why Harris's pitch to Muslim and Arab American voters is failing. Opinion: Harris's closing argument is dishonest, desperate, and hypocritical. Trump isn't a fascist, and he didn't say he would use the military against his political opponents. What? Opinion: Kamala Harris needs a minute. Why does the vice president struggle to find succinct answers to obvious questions? That's confusing. Did someone put Jeff Bezos under full control? Was Jeff Bezos some kind of sleeper agent? Were his strings cut? Did he flip a la Elon Musk, a guy that sure seemed to be on board with the regime program 10 years ago? He was one of the climate change superstars. What is going on with Jeff Bezos? Very much like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos has his own rocket ship company called Blue Origin, and they operate out of a West Texas ranch called Corn Ranch. I've been paying attention to that for like 4 years. It's part of what led me to thinking about drainage in the first place. Yesterday, Chuck Grassley posted a picture on X, formerly Twitter, of a cornfield whose corn had been harvested. Now, I don't know what that means. Maybe it's all just a coincidence. But what has happened to the Washington Post? So many things are just not what we were told they were. This is the New York Post from yesterday. Ex-House Speaker Kevin McCarthy emerges as a dark horse candidate for Trump Chief of Staff role. Kevin McCarthy could lead a new House soon, the Post has learned. The ousted former Speaker of the House is widely seen as a top contender to be former President Donald Trump's first Chief of Staff if he retakes the White House following the November 5th election, according to sources familiar with the deliberations. No final decision has been made, and there's no sign that McCarthy is campaigning for the coveted role, though one person said the Californian has shown openness to being part of a second Trump administration in some capacity. The article discusses the possibility of Susie Wiles being named to the position and goes on. Another GOP source who agreed that Wiles is the most likely to be Chief of Staff, at least for part of Trump's first year in office, should he become the 47th president, said McCarthy is so widely believed to be interested in the Chief of Staff gig that insiders speculate on stories he may be involved with that could be shaping the ex-president's thinking. Not a very artful sentence there. A third source, however, told the Post that McCarthy expressed disinterest in being the White House Chief of Staff as recently as this week, saying Kevin legit doesn't want it. Wasn't McCarthy ousted for being anti-Trump? Didn't he get kicked out by those MAGA extremists in Congress? How could this even be a possibility? Well, either that wasn't how it was presented to us, or maybe the thought is that the GOP establishment is somehow going to find enough leverage to put Kevin McCarthy next to Donald Trump in the next Trump administration. Who is controlling who here? Does Trump seem like he's the one being controlled? Does it seem like he's in a position where he has to make major concessions to the Uniparty on behalf of the global regime? Doesn't sound like that to me. And then there's this from yesterday in the New York Times. Trump flirts with the ultimate tax cut. No income taxes at all. Huh? Well, how about that? Back in June, I made an episode called Read My Lips, No Taxes, where I argued that there would be no federal income tax. One, because it's unconstitutional, and two, because with the separation from the global regime fiat currency and perhaps moves to alternative currencies like Bitcoin, and with the Fed being brought back under Treasury, there would be no need or justification for the global regime's collection arm, the IRS, to be doing anything. Trump has done as projected. He has upped the stakes on which taxes he will cut over the course of the last few months, promising to eliminate taxes on tips, on Social Security, on overtime pay. That has to end with an elimination of the federal income tax. From the article, during a Fox News segment on Monday, Mr. Trump took questions at a barbershop in the Bronx. When asked if the United States could potentially end all federal taxation, Mr. Trump said the country could return to the economic policies in the late 19th century, when there was no federal income tax. It had all tariffs. It didn't have an income tax, Mr. Trump said. Now we have income taxes and we have people that are dying. They're paying tax and they don't have the money to pay the tax. In June, Mr. Trump floated the idea of replacing federal revenue from income taxes with money received from tariffs. Mr. Trump has not provided specific details on how that would work, and it is unclear if he wants to eliminate all federal taxes, including corporate income taxes and payroll taxes, or only end the individual income tax. Either way, both liberal and conservative experts have dismissed his idea as mathematically impossible and economically destructive. Even if Republicans control Congress, lawmakers are unlikely to dismantle the income tax system. Yet Mr. Trump's combination of tax cuts and tariff increases has been central to his political pitch. Replacing income taxes with tariffs would reverse the progressivity of the tax system in the United States. In general, income taxes are progressive, meaning that Americans with more income pay a higher tax rate. Tariffs which impose a tax on products imported into the United States, are regressive. They raise the prices on imported items like clothing and groceries, placing a larger burden on lower-income Americans who spend a bigger percentage of their income on those goods. And of course, that is the economically illiterate version, the very pro-global regime version, but that doesn't make it true. What this is an argument that the taxes must remain in place. And how about that for your media? Trump suggests removing the federal income tax, something that should not exist in the first place, and the media freaks out. They go through a regime-oriented version of the history on the income tax, and toward the end, overall, his agenda would raise taxes on low-income Americans, provide a tax break for the richest, and drastically increase the deficit, according to an analysis from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, a liberal think tank. A challenge for raising revenue from tariffs is that placing a tax on imports tends to cut the amount of trade and therefore reduce the amount of revenue collected from tariffs. Raising tariff rates high enough to try and replace income taxes could end trade with the United States, said Wendy Edelberg, a former chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office. You're going to send imported goods to zero, and then you're going to have no tax revenue, Ms. Edelberg said. Ah, sure, Ms. Edelberg. How about, instead of taking your word for it, we just go ahead and try it and see how it works out? I know there might be an adjustment period, but let's just go ahead and get through it. Steep tariffs could prompt foreign trading partners to retaliate with tariffs of their own, reducing American exports and slowing economic growth. Mr. Trump has experience with this phenomenon. While president, he wound up having to bail out American farmers whose exports to China slumped during a protracted trade war. Or perhaps he fortified them so that the regime couldn't cause famines as they've attempted to do elsewhere in this time and historically. It's like these globalists don't even want America to be self-sufficient. Is there any reason why America couldn't be self-sufficient? If other countries had goods to export and we wanted to purchase those goods, they could still be purchased just at a more expensive rate if we choose to buy the goods from a foreign country rather than produce them here. This just encourages the re-onshoring of American manufacturing, which has always been a MAGA agenda item. Can the United States reach self-sufficiency? Yes. In fact, that's absolutely critical to remaining a superpower in the emerging multipolar world order. And I just want to hit one more thing before we wrap up for today. It's quite a long article, but yesterday, the Wall Street Journal published a piece with the headline, Elon Musk's Secret Conversations with Vladimir Putin. So we'll bring it all the way around. Elon Musk, the world's richest man and a linchpin of U.S. space efforts, has been in regular contact with Russian President Vladimir Putin since late 2022. The discussions, confirmed by several current and former U.S., European, and Russian officials, touch on personal topics, business, and geopolitical tensions. At one point, Putin asked the billionaire to avoid activating his Starlink satellite service over Taiwan as a favor to Chinese leader Xi Jinping, said two people briefed on the request. Musk has emerged this year as a crucial supporter of Donald Trump's election campaign and could find a role in a Trump administration should he win. While the U.S. and its allies have isolated Putin in recent years, Musk's dialogue could signal re-engagement with the Russian leader and reinforce Trump's expressed desire to cut a deal over major fault lines such as the war in Ukraine. At the same time, the contacts also raised potential national security concerns among some in the current administration, given Putin's role as one of America's chief adversaries. Musk has forged deep business ties with the U.S. military and intelligence agencies, giving him unique visibility into some of America's most sensitive space programs. SpaceX, which operates the Starlink service, won a $1.8 billion classified contract in 2021 and is the primary rocket launcher for the Pentagon and NASA. Musk has a security clearance that allows him to access certain classified information. Knowledge of Musk's Kremlin contacts appears to be a closely held secret in government. Several White House officials said they weren't aware of them. The topic is highly sensitive, given Musk's increasing involvement in the Trump campaign and the approaching U.S. presidential election less than 2 weeks away. Musk didn't respond to requests for comment. The billionaire has called criticism from some quarters that he has become an apologist for Putin absurd and has said his companies, quote, have done more to undermine Russia than anything, end quote. Is he right about that? Who knows? But he has supplied Starlink internet to Ukraine, so that couldn't have helped Russia, right? I mean, unless we're being lied to about what's happening over there. Elon Musk is like one of the most powerful antagonists of Venezuelan communist dictator, for sure. Nicolas Maduro, isn't he? He challenged Maduro to a fist fight and called him a donkey and promised to send him to Mars. And Maduro's in that picture at the BRICS summit in Kazan, smiling and shaking hands with Vladimir Putin. Elon Musk is an enemy of all of Putin's friends. What could it mean? I don't know, but one of the Rachel Maddows named Keith Olbermann must know. He posted last night upon reading this story on Elon Musk's platform, by the way, X, formerly Twitter. We need to arrest and detain Elon Musk immediately. He is operating on behalf of Russia. Cancel all contracts, seize his facilities, lock him away in a military facility. Now, POTUS, not tomorrow. Wow, it sounds like one of the Rachel Maddows is calling Elon Musk the enemy within. And man, all of this is just so strange. These are the smartest people in our entire society. These are our elites and wannabe elites. These are our betters. These are very serious intellectuals. The sorts of people who know what's going on. Not like us. We're morons and rubes. We are the non-college educated. I mean, I have a college education, but as soon as you support Donald Trump, your college education just disappears. Plus, we're conspiracy theorists. We're MAGA extremists. No matter what, we are wrong about everything and they are right about everything. They've been right about everything this whole time. COVID was a very deadly pandemic. Masks worked. Lockdowns worked. There weren't going to be any problems with the election. Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes. We started telling the big lie. A very violent insurrection happened. Then they mandated vaccines, but those were for our safety and our health. And we were science deniers and vaccine deniers. We were the stupid people. We endangered everyone. Who knows how many grandmas we killed? I mean, we sided with Russia on their very brutal invasion of Ukraine. We killed so many women by taking away their right to kill their babies. We thought we had a red wave, but nope. We totally lost the 2022 midterms for the uniparty right. That was our fault as MAGA supporters, Trump supporters. We supported Donald Trump in the fake primaries. And I mean, that was crazy. There's no way Donald Trump could ever win in the primaries. But of course, in fake primaries, he absolutely crushed it. We didn't accept the TV's word about the paragliding go-karts. On every single issue, we've been wrong. And these people like Keith Olbermann and all the other versions of Rachel Maddow, they've been right because they're so much smarter than us. And we're conspiracy theorists. We're not even operating in reality. And I know all that's true because they tell us it's true. And if we say otherwise, we get censored so you don't find anyone ever saying anything otherwise. But here we are, coming right down to the wire. We are chopping away, and the tree's kind of just swaying a little bit. It's getting a little wobbly. Who knows? Eventually, it might fall over. And it seems like it might happen soon because all of these people are panicking. They're concerned about prison or worse, just from having careers that necessitate undermining the interests of these United States and the American people, violating our Constitution and the public trust, committing crimes against America and crimes against humanity. And because they're so smart, it seems like they're realizing something that we just don't realize. They actually are losing control of the media, the propaganda apparatus that controls people and entities and organizations through blackmail based on their corruption and compromise. They're losing control of global finance and the power of the regime's fiat currency, their ability to wage economic warfare through sanctions and by debanking individuals, getting everyone to conform to the agenda. And it seems like they might even be losing their control over the military as well, because no one seems to be scared of the regime anymore. I mean, we have some groveling and trembling Trump supporters who think everything depends on who the television tells us is our next God King after we spend a day pressing buttons on an iPad attached to a black box down at the local middle school cafeteria. But aside from that, doesn't seem like MAGA's scared. These people sure are. I wonder why. I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon down on the range.